Mist hung over London like a damp silk scarf, curling in the corners of gaslit streets, softening the edges of carriage wheels and the polished boots of passing gentlemen. In the heart of Mayfair, the sound of gossip travelled faster than the clip-clop of horses, sharper than any blade, and Eleanor Hargrave felt it prick her with the cold precision of a surgeon's scalpel. She stepped from a modest carriage, hands gloved, chin high, yet her heart thumped a tremulous cadence beneath the delicate lace of her bodice. The threshold before her was grand, carved mahogany flanked with marble columns. Inside, the drawing-room shimmered with crystal and candlelight, yet the warmth of wealth offered no sanctuary against the chill of judgment. Eleanor's entrance was met with the polite rustle of skirts and the almost imperceptible tilt of heads, subtle betrayals that whispered, "Why is she here?" Her eyes, a tempered gray, scanned the assembly. Noble women exchanged secretive glances behind their fans, their smiles too tight to be genuine. Gentlemen murmured in low tones, words muffled but sharp, and she caught fragments, a dagger of sound. The Hargrave girl, unfit, surely, the Duke must be joking. She had rehearsed composure, but the weight of their scrutiny pressed against her ribs, a suffocating, invisible corset. Eleanor drew a slow breath, letting the mist of the morning settle on her shoulders as though it could cloak her in invisibility. Yet invisibility was precisely what she feared most. To be erased without dignity was the cruelest possibility of all. At the far end of the room, standing taller than all who surrounded him, was Henry Ashford, the Duke of Westcliff. His presence was a study in restrained authority, a figure carved from shadow and light, the faint gleam of metals on his chest catching the candlelight, but his face unreadable, composed, magnetic. He inclined his head slightly, as though greeting her, and Eleanor's stomach tightened. The room seemed to inhale and pause. Even the chandeliers above, glittering with crystal prisms, trembled in silent anticipation. Here was a man who had been whispered about in every salon and society column, the golden standard of wealth, charm, and unyielding expectation. And he had chosen her. The Duke's choice had not softened the sting of the crowd. Indeed, it had sharpened it. A ripple of scandal coursed through the assembly, subtle yet undeniable, and Eleanor felt it like wind against bare skin. The murmurs evolved into stifled laughter, the sort that did not dare meet her gaze directly, yet clanged in her ears like church bells tolling judgment. One of the older ladies, her face carved with years of artificial serenity, drew herself up with a sniff that carried both disbelief and superiority. The Hargrave girl, marrying a duke? Pray, tell me. Her sense fled England entirely. The words floated through the room, a public lash meant to expose her worthlessness. Eleanor's gloved fingers clenched around the edge of her fan, hidden from view, and she tilted her head, offering nothing more than a measured, quiet nod. She would not grant them the satisfaction of a faltering voice. The crowd continued to swirl, a living tapestry of polite cruelty. Their eyes did not just see her. They weighed, measured, and catalogued her faults as though her humanity were merely a ledger entry. Every inch of silk on her gown, every bead sewn to its bodice, was scrutinized for insufficiency, for evidence that she did not belong. Yet Eleanor moved with the precision of one who has rehearsed dignity in solitude, letting each step be a quiet rebellion against the tide of derision. Even in her humiliation, there was a fragile, stubborn grace, a reminder that she could endure without surrendering herself entirely. The subtle scent of lilac clung to her, a gentle defiance, a memory of childhood gardens that had known laughter long before society had imposed its harsh tally of worth. A servant approached, whispering the announcement that would ignite every tongue and sharpen every eyebrow. The Duke had indeed come to claim her as his bride. The words echoed through the room as though spoken by a choir of distant angels, or perhaps devils. Eleanor could not tell which. She felt a shiver that was neither cold nor fear, but the tremor of history in motion, of fate brushing against her life with unseen fingers. Noble ladies stiffened, their faces betraying scandalized disbelief. Gentlemen murmured phrases carefully chosen to veil their astonishment with civility. The murmurs transformed into glances that hovered too long, assessing, dissecting, calculating. Eleanor's heart thrummed with a strange mix of dread and something stranger still, hope, flickering faint and fragile, yet stubbornly bright against the darkness of judgment. The Duke, unflinching, finally crossed the room to stand beside her. Each step he took was measured, deliberate, a quiet declaration that he belonged to no one but his own principles, and in that, he had chosen her. His hand extended with the calm assurance of inevitability, and Eleanor raised her own, meeting it. The touch was brief, electric, a promise in silence that defied every whisper of society's contempt. She could feel the faint tremor in his fingers, the almost imperceptible pulse that spoke of a man who, for all his composure, bore the weight of expectation as heavily as she bore the weight of scorn. In that moment, the room's laughter and disapproval seemed to blur, a distant tide receding from the firmness of their united stance. A sudden, involuntary smile brushed Eleanor's lips, not the triumph of arrogance, but the quiet, private acknowledgement that she had survived the gauntlet of judgment with her dignity intact. For the first time that morning, she allowed herself to imagine the possibility of being seen, truly seen, by one whose eyes mattered more than the entire assembly. The Duke's gaze held hers, and within it was neither mockery nor indulgence, but recognition, of endurance, of grace, of the fire that had refused to be extinguished by gossip and derision. The room continued its whispering, but Eleanor felt herself rising above it, not in spite of a humiliation, but because she had endured it, because she had met it with composure and quiet courage. And yet, even as she allowed herself this fragile triumph, a shadow passed through the Duke's expression, a flicker of something hidden, something unspoken that promised the scandal was far from over. Eleanor could not yet know it, but the world outside these walls would soon strain against the revelation of his choice, and tonight, every whispered word would carry weight she could not yet measure. As the chandeliers sparkled overhead, she drew a breath, steadying herself, and felt the faint's true tremor of anticipation, not for society's acceptance, nor for the relief of vindication, but for the man beside her, whose hand in hers whispered of storms yet to come. And in that silent, electric moment, Eleanor understood that her life had shifted irrevocably, and that the laughter of England had only begun the day after the announcement arrived cloaked in a quiet storm. London's streets were slick with rain, puddles reflecting the grey sky in fractured diamonds, as if the city itself could not decide whether to mourn or celebrate. Eleanor Hargrave remained in her drawing room, seated by a narrow window, watching droplets race down the glass. A small package had arrived that morning, wrapped in cream paper, tied with a ribbon the color of deepest violet. No handmaid carried it. No announcement preceded it. It simply waited upon the velvet cushion of her writing desk, a quiet declaration that defied the clamoring society outside. She untied the ribbon with trembling fingers, revealing an embroidered handkerchief. Its fabric was fine as spider silk, yet the delicate stitching, the Duke's initials entwined with a sprig of wild violet, spoke with intimacy louder than any grandiose gesture. Eleanor's breath caught. A heat rose to her cheeks that had nothing to do with vanity. This was acknowledgment. This was attention, intentional and irrevocable. Yet attention, she quickly remembered, was a double-edged sword. No sooner had she folded the handkerchief and pressed it to her chest than the first notes of scandal arrived, delivered not by courier but by the sharper instruments of society. Letters pressed into her hands, ink-stained envelopes that carried polite inquiry laced with thinly veiled malice. "Pray, Lady Hargrave, are you certain you can uphold the dignity required of your station?" One asked, the cursive lines curling like whips across the page. Another, "The Duke's choice baffles all who hold his acquaintance dear. We hope his judgment is not impaired by sentiment." Eleanor read each one with steady eyes, yet the pulse of indignation and anxiety ran beneath her skin like an undercurrent, ready to pull her under. She folded each letter neatly, stacking them as one might stack stones to build a wall, and allowed herself a quiet, defiant thought. They will not dictate the measure of my heart. By evening, the whispers had escalated. At the ballroom of Lady Westcombe, known for both her crystal chandeliers and her exquisite malice, Eleanor found herself the center of every whispered conjecture. Ladies in gowns of silk and satin traced her outline with sharp eyes. Gentlemen tipped their heads in disbelieving bows, as if to say, how could he choose her? She felt their gaze like icy fingers upon her shoulders. Yet, the Duke arrived not with the staid formality of etiquette, but with a quiet audacity that unsettled the room. His presence was a silent statement, a refusal to shrink before the judgment of 1,000 tongues. He did not smile at the disapproving faces. He did not offer excuses or explanations. He simply extended a hand toward Eleanor, and with the subtle magnetism of inevitability, he drew her into the room's center. They moved together with the precision of those accustomed to ceremony yet untouched by vanity. Candlelight caught the glimmer of his eyes, and for Eleanor, it seemed that the rest of the ballroom had faded into a blur of muted colors and murmurs. Each step beside him was a small rebellion, a quiet assertion of claim that spoke louder than the most scathing letter. And when he whispered, ever so softly, let them talk. We have our own measure of truth. It carried through the tumult in a way no voice could, imprinting upon her a courage that was half relief, half wonder. Yet even this assurance carried a shadow. Society was relentless, and the Duke's attentions, as tender and precise as they were, could not shield her from all scrutiny. Later that week, Eleanor found herself the recipient of another, more tangible token, a delicate silver locket, its surface etched with intricate filigree and the faint scent of the Duke's cologne lingering within. She pressed it to her lips, aware of the scandalous eyes that would leer if this gift were discovered prematurely. It was not wealth that astounded her, nor the craftsmanship, but the thoughtfulness, the attention to the quiet corners of her heart that only he seemed able to perceive. Yet the very existence of the locket seemed to fan the flames of gossip. A visiting cousin, with eyes sharp and unkind, leaned close under the pretense of inquiry. Surely he does not intend. I cannot imagine you will be content in such company, she said, voice hunted yet barbed. Eleanor smiled, a mask of gentle civility, yet her mind trembled with the audacity of her situation. To be both cherished privately and despised publicly, a paradox she could neither explain nor escape. Even within her own household, servants whispered, curious and cautious, some admiring, some wary. A footman, whose loyalty had long been proven, murmured as he polished silver, Madam, the town will speak. But the Duke, he seems different. Intent. Eleanor nodded, uncertain whether to take comfort or tremble at the intensity that word carried. Outside, rain tapped against the windows with steady persistence, an accompaniment to her racing thoughts. Every stroke of thunder seemed to echo the murmurs of London's elite, every flash of lightning illuminating the fragility of her position in stark relief. Yet, despite the tension, despite the ever-present threat of humiliation, Eleanor felt a strange, growing certainty. The Duke's gestures, small, precise, and defiant, were the first proof that she need not cower before the world's judgment. A particularly audacious moment arrived at the theater, where Eleanor, seated discreetly in a box at the side of the stage, found herself under the gaze of every onlooker. The Duke arrived mid-scene, slipping into the shadow of the balcony, his presence a silent statement that he would neither conceal nor apologize for his choice. When his hand brushed hers, a spark of recognition passed between them, both public and private, a gesture that made Eleanor's pulse stutter in rhythm with the orchestra. Murmurs rippled through the theater, fans rustled, eyes narrowed, whispers sharpened like the teeth of a wolf. Yet Eleanor met his gaze, and for the briefest instant, the scandal felt almost irrelevant, diminished by the intensity of a bond that no letter, no jest, no societal sneer could touch. Still, the storm outside, both literal and figurative, persisted. The next morning, Eleanor awoke to a note slipped beneath her door, unsigned, yet brimming with venom. The Duke's taste has abandoned reason. You, Lady Hargrave, will rue the day you accepted what should never have been offered. She read the words, folded the note with deliberate calm, and set it aside, her reflection in the glass showing a woman at war with her own pulse. She touched the handkerchief, then the locket, feeling the contrast of intimacy and scorn, love and judgment. A strange power coursed through her. The tokens were not mere objects, but proofs of possibility, of defiance, of a private truth that might yet triumph over public contempt. As night fell, Eleanor stood at the balcony of a modest home, gazing at the rain-slicked streets, candlelight from distant windows twinkling like scattered stars. Somewhere, the Duke moved through London, his presence a shield, a challenge, a promise. She pressed the locket to her heart once more, sensing that these small gestures were the first chapters of a story the world was not yet ready to understand. And as lightning traced the clouds in brilliant, jagged arcs, Eleanor felt a thrill of anticipation, a quiet terror, and a fragile, shimmering hope all at once. The tokens had been given, the whispers had begun, and the stage was set. The scandal was no longer a distant threat. It had arrived, and it would follow her into every room, every glance, every heartbeat. Yet, in the Duke's unseen hand resting upon her life, Eleanor felt a pulse of rebellion, a promise that the coming storm might reveal not ruin, but something far more dangerous: devotion. The gardens of the Duke's estate lay cloaked in twilight, the day's rain having left each leaf and blade of grass glistening with a fragile sheen, as if the world itself had been washed clean and made ready for confession. Eleanor Hargrave walked the gravel path, her skirts brushing softly against the damp stones, the air heavy with the scent of wet earth and blooming roses, a fragrance that seemed to pulse with life even in the encroaching darkness. She felt the weight of the day's gossip still clinging to her like dew, the whispers of London's elite pressing against her chest. Yet here, beneath the bowers and the shadowed arches, she felt, precariously, tremulously, free. The Duke's presence was already there, waiting, as if he had anticipated his step, as if the garden itself were part of his silent counsel. He emerged from the shadow of a yew tree, tall, broad-shouldered, his dark coat brushing the wet leaves, the candlelight from the estate reflecting in his eyes like twin pools of quiet fire. Eleanor stopped, breath caught between admiration and fear, and he inclined his head, the faintest curve of his lips suggesting both amusement and gravitas. "You walk as though the world is waiting for your misstep," he said softly, his voice a velvet murmur against the hush of the evening. "Yet I see only a woman who has survived every misstep that might have undone her." There was no audience here, only the delicate rustle of wind through branches, yet his words bore a weight that felt heavier than any crowded ballroom. They began to walk, side by side, the gravel crunching softly beneath their steps, a rhythm almost intimate in its cadence. Eleanor felt the tension in her chest loosen, though not entirely. It had become habit to brace herself, to armor her heart against judgment. Yet with the Duke, she found the armor unnecessary, if terrifying. "Do you truly not care what they say of us?" she asked, voice hesitant but carrying a fragile edge of defiance. Her gray eyes, pale and luminous in the dim light, searched his face for the hint of mockery, the trace of the condescension she had learned to expect. The Duke's hand brushed against his, almost accidentally, almost tenderly, and he met her gaze with a steadiness that unsettled her more than scorn ever had. "I care for nothing save truth," he said, "and truth, Lady Eleanor, lies not in the whispering of salons nor the ink of scandalous letters. It lies here." His hand brushed gently over his chest, and here, he inclined his head toward hers, though his touch did not presume intimacy, in the courage of those who dare to meet it. There was a pause, a silence in which the world seemed to shrink to the space between them, and Eleanor felt a tremor of understanding stir deep within her. This was no ordinary devotion. It was audacious, defiant, and terrifying in its purity. They found themselves at a stone bench, damp from the afternoon rain, and sat, shoulders almost touching, the scent of roses mingling with the faint smoke of the estate's distant hearth. Eleanor's hands, gloved yet clammy, rested in her lap. "I am not worthy," she confessed, voice barely above the whisper of the evening wind. "They see only the shadow of my family, my past, the mistakes I cannot erase. And yet, here you are. I cannot understand why you chose me." Her eyes, downcast, reflected the glimmering garden lights, and in them swirled vulnerability, fear, and longing. The Duke's expression softened, the firmness of command melting into something more human, more tender. "You mistake choice for folly, Lady Eleanor," he said, his hand finally covering hers in a gesture deliberate and slow, a tether of reassurance. "I have seen the strength that hides behind your measured smile, the courage that bends beneath scrutiny yet refuses to break. I have seen the fire that no whisper can diminish. Do not undervalue it, nor yourself. I do not choose you despite these things, but because of them." His words, like carefully struck chords, resonated in her chest. Eleanor's pulse quickened, a tempest restrained only by the delicate hand that now held hers. The confession of truth shifted the balance of the evening. Eleanor, encouraged by the quiet solemnity of his presence, ventured further. "And you, my duke, do you not fear disappointment? That I may falter under their gaze, that I may be insufficient?" The words trembled with humility, yet their honesty was a delicate weapon. The duke's thumb brushed her knuckles, an infinitesimal caress that carried a weight far greater than any statement of intent. "I have never sought perfection, Eleanor," he said, voice low, earnest. "Only authenticity. If society cannot bear to witness it, that is their failing, not ours. With you, I require nothing else." For a moment, the world contracted to their shared space, the rustle of leaves above their heads punctuating the unspoken depth of their connection. Eleanor's fears, honed over years of scorn and whispered malice, found no purchase here. She allowed herself, for the briefest instant, to imagine a future untainted by judgment, to imagine evenings spent in shared understanding, mornings brushed with quiet devotion. Yet the intensity of the moment was tempered by the persistent drum of reality, the letters, the stays, the salons that would never cease their scrutiny. A sudden sound, a distant footstep, the rustle of a servant navigating the grounds, pulled Eleanor from the edge of reverie. She rose, hand still in his, heart clanging against the walls of prudence and propriety. The duke followed, his grip unyielding, guiding without force, reassuring without words. "They will speak," he murmured, almost to himself. "But let them. We know the truth that binds us. That is all that matters." Eleanor met his gaze, and in that moment, something inside her shifted. The fragile courage that had withstood ridicule and gossip was now reinforced, strengthened by the knowledge that she was not alone, that the man beside her bore the weight of scrutiny with her, even should society's whispers grow to a tempest. As they returned to the house, lantern lights spilling over wet cobblestones, Eleanor felt a mixture of exhilaration and apprehension, a thrill of intimacy tempered by the awareness that the world beyond the garden would never cease its scrutiny. The duke's hand lingered at her back, a subtle assertion of presence and protection, and she realized that the private confession they had shared was a turning point, a moment where fear had met defiance, where judgment had met trust, and where possibility had dared to exist alongside scandal. She breathed deeply, the scent of wet roses and half-smoke mingling with the lingering fragrance of his coat, and felt the stirrings of hope that were as delicate as the petals around her feet yet as unyielding as the stone path beneath. And yet, even as they crossed the threshold into the warm light of the estate, Eleanor could not ignore the shadow that lingered behind the duke's otherwise steady gaze, a flicker of tension that hinted at secrets unspoken, battles yet to come. The world outside, relentless in its judgment, had only begun its scrutiny, and the intimacy they had claimed in the garden was fragile, a private flame threatened by the winds of society. Eleanor's pulse quickened, anticipation mingling with the certainty that the coming days would test every ounce of courage she now felt, and that the true measure of their bond had yet to be revealed. In the quiet, electric pause between them, she understood that the storm was only gathering, and that their hearts would be the first battlefield. The ballroom of Westcliff Manor glimmered like a cathedral of light, each chandelier ablaze with hundreds of candles, the golden reflections dancing across crystal glasses and polished parquet floors. The scent of roses and warmed wax mingled with the faint trace of spiced wine, a heady perfume that stirred both expectation and anxiety. Eleanor Hargrave entered with measured grace, her skirts whispering against the floor as though speaking in a secret language of resilience. Each step was a statement, a silent defiance of the murmured judgments that followed her like shadows. Noble women in silks of emerald and sapphire tilted their heads, eyes narrowing behind delicate fans. Gentlemen, stiff in evening coats, shifted uneasily, aware that the Duke's choice had not only scandalized but unsettled the very order they prized. Eleanor felt their stays like frost on bare skin, yet she walked as though the world's breath could not sway her. The Duke of Westcliff was already present, standing at the room's center, a figure of quiet command amid the glittering assembly. His dark coat caught the light, buttons gleaming like polished obsidian, while his gaze swept the crowd with a precision that discomfited even the most composed of guests. When his eyes fell upon Eleanor, a subtle warmth softened the stern lines of his face. He gestured toward her with the faintest inclination of his head, an acknowledgment that carried the weight of sovereignty and affection simultaneously. The room's whispering hushed, as though some unspoken recognition passed through the assembly. The Duke had arrived not merely to appear, but to declare. Eleanor approached, heart thrumming in rhythm with the faint strains of a string quartet tucked into the far gallery. The whispers of scandal, the letters of disdain, the sideways glances, they all seemed suddenly inconsequential in the light of his presence. He extended his hand, palm open, an invitation both simple and profound. She took it, and for the briefest instant, the ballroom existed solely for them, a private sphere within a public spectacle. The guests, sensing the shift, stilled, curiosity sharpening into tension. The Duke's voice, when he finally spoke, carried with it the authority of command and the intimacy of confession. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, low and measured, each syllable precise, "you may find cause to question my judgment, to speculate upon motives and propriety. You may whisper, as the habit of this city compels, of the suitability of my choice. Yet here, before all who claim to know decorum, I declare that Lady Eleanor Hargrave possesses virtues beyond your comprehension." The words rang through the room like a bell tolling for truth. Eleanor's chest tightened, her fingers clutching the delicate lace of her sleeve, yet her gaze remained steady, meeting his with the quiet astonishment of one who had begun to believe in possibility. The Duke continued, voice rising not in anger but in the serene force of certainty. Her courage, her dignity, and the strength of her character have been tested by the merciless standards of society, and she has endured where many would have faltered. Let it be known, I do not choose her as a matter of fashion, nor convenience, nor fleeting sentiment. I choose her because she commands my admiration, my respect, and my unwavering devotion. She is worthy not only of my name but of my heart. A hush fell over the assembly. Chandeliers trembled in reflected light, fans froze mid-motion, and the murmurs that had followed Eleanor like ghosts stilled as though struck dumb. A lady in emerald, known for her sharp tongue and sharper envy, rose as if to interrupt, but the Duke's gaze met hers with a calm, immovable intensity. "You may leave, if your conscience cannot abide my declaration," he said quietly. Yet the words carried a quiet power that settled the room. She faltered, fan trembling in hand, and slowly sank back into her chair. The statement was not merely a public affirmation. It was a challenge to the entire social order, a refusal to yield to whispers and scandal. Eleanor felt the weight of this gesture pressing against her, a declaration not only of love but of defiance. After a moment, the Duke turned to Eleanor, his expression softening, the firmness of command giving way to something wholly private yet profoundly public. "Eleanor," he murmured, voice low enough that only she could hear, "tonight, you are not merely the subject of society's speculation. You are the measure of truth in a world that prefers illusion. Walk beside me, not as an object of their curiosity, but as the partner I have chosen." The heat of his gaze, the intimacy of his tone, made the room around her blur, leaving only the certainty of his devotion, the solidity of his hand in hers. Eleanor's pulse quickened, a mixture of awe and relief, as she realized the enormity of what had transpired. The room's whispers had not ceased entirely, but they were now accompanied by the cautious respect that follows courage, by the hesitant admiration that follows defiance. She straightened her shoulders, lifted her chin, and allowed herself a quiet, triumphant smile. She had endured, she had been tested, and in the act of enduring, she had been acknowledged, not merely tolerated, but celebrated by the man whose judgment mattered most. The emotional tide that had threatened to overwhelm her now receded, leaving clarity in its place. Scandal may follow, but truth had been claimed, and it was irrevocable. The Duke led her to the center of the room, where a quartet played a gentle waltz, and she found herself moving with a grace born of relief and elation. Each step was both defiance and affirmation, a dance that defied the whispers and speculation surrounding them. The eyes of the assembly, once sharp and critical, softened with reluctant recognition of the bond they could not deny. Eleanor felt the delicate brush of his hand against hers, a tactile reinforcement of the verbal declaration he had made. The intimacy of the gesture, subtle yet profound, cemented the private knowledge they shared amidst the public spectacle. And yet, even in this triumph, Eleanor sensed the undercurrent of tension that lingered. Letters would still arrive, whispers would still circulate, and society's judgment would continue to press against the edges of their lives. The Duke, aware of her awareness, squeezed her hand gently, a silent promise of protection and solidarity. The private resolve they shared was a shield against the persistent storm of scrutiny, yet it was also a reminder that victory in the court of hearts did not erase the trials of the world beyond. As the evening waned and the guests began to withdraw, Eleanor lingered near the balcony, candlelight flickering over her face, eyes reflecting the glow of distant lanterns in the gardens below. The Duke approached, cloak brushing the floor, and offered a final gesture that encapsulated both their triumph and the unspoken challenges yet to come. He presented a small, gilded locket, its surface etched with delicate vines, a token of devotion, a symbol of commitment, and a subtle reminder that their private truths would always endure beyond the reach of public opinion. Eleanor accepted it with trembling fingers, pressing it to her heart, aware that the scandal outside had not vanished but had been tempered by the force of declaration, by the audacity of love made visible. And as the final candlelight shimmered in crystal and marble, Eleanor understood that the declaration was both an ending and a beginning. She had been acknowledged, celebrated, and embraced, yet the world beyond the ballroom doors remained vigilant, its whispers only quieted, never silenced. The Duke's hand remained over hers, a tether and a promise, and she felt the pulse of possibility beating through her veins. Tonight had proven that courage and devotion could confront scorn, that intimacy could survive exposure, and that love could transform even the most rigid of expectations. Yet in the hush of victory, Eleanor could not shake the awareness that the storm was only momentarily stilled, and that their most profound trials, the ones that would define both heart and society, were still to come. The Duke's chamber was a sanctuary of soft light, the fire casting golden shadows across oak panels carved with the lineage of Westcliffe's ancestors. Eleanor Hargrave paused at the threshold, the lace of her gown brushing against the polished floor, her breath caught between anticipation and the lingering weight of months of scrutiny. Outside, London whispered its judgment, its gossip a distant hum. Yet within these walls, time seemed to slow, folding around her like velvet. The Duke stood near the hearth, coat removed, the shirt beneath revealing broad shoulders and the faint trace of workman-like tension that bespoke evenings spent managing estates and expectations alike. He looked at her, a quiet intensity in his gaze, neither commanding nor demanding, but entirely present. "Eleanor," he said, voice low, deliberate, carrying the resonance of all the unspoken months. "Tonight, nothing exists between us but truth." His words were simple, yet weighted with the gravity of promise. Eleanor felt the flutter in her chest, a mixture of fear and hope, and took a tentative step closer. She had walked into rooms of scorn, survived salons that whispered her inadequacy, endured letters dripping with malice, and yet the intimacy of this moment, unobserved, unjudged, held a power all its own. Their bond would be measured not by whispers or gossip, but by their courage to meet one another wholly, without facade. The Duke approached, closing the space with a deliberate slowness, the heat of the fire brushing against his features. "I cannot promise ease," he murmured, "nor immunity from those who would see us fall. But I can promise this. My devotion is unwavering, and my heart knows no compromise. Eleanor's hand rose, trembling slightly, until his fingers enclosed hers. The contact was electric, yet tender, a grounding in reality that carried more weight than any whispered romance in society's drawing rooms. She drew in a steadying breath and allowed herself, for the first time fully, to meet the intensity in his eyes, the truth he bore for her alone. He presented a small, leather-bound journal, worn at the edges, its pages marked with careful script. I have recorded everything I could not speak aloud in salons or parlors, he said softly. Every thought, every hope, every fear about this union. It is yours to read, if you dare. Eleanor accepted it with reverence, feeling the weight of his words before she even opened the cover. She traced the embossed cover with her fingertips, sensing in it the quiet insistence of a man who had dared defy expectation not once, but repeatedly, to honor her entirely. She glanced up, and their eyes met, a silent acknowledgment passing between them. Love measured in courage, proof in action, devotion in constancy. The first page revealed a confession of solitude. The Duke's life, though filled with grandeur, had been hollow, a succession of duties and public appearances masking the yearning for someone who could see him without artifice. Eleanor read the delicate lines, absorbing the weight of his vulnerability. He had exposed not weakness, but authenticity, an intimacy so profound it startled her, even as it filled the corners of her heart with warmth. As she read, she felt the years of judgment, the months of whispered doubts, begin to dissipate. They could not touch this truth. It belonged to them alone, sacred and indomitable. A knock at the door broke the silence, the subtlest reminder that the world beyond the chamber still existed. Eleanor paused, hand lingering on the journal, and the Duke's eyes softened. "Let them wait," he said quietly, "for no intrusion can undo what we have claimed here tonight." His words carried a resolute authority, not of control but of protection, and Eleanor felt herself relax, the tension in her shoulders unwinding as if the firelight had melted it away. She closed the journal and lifted her gaze, finally meeting him fully, not as a duke, nor as a symbol of power, but as a man whose heart had been entwined with hers in a bond society could neither sever nor define. The Duke extended his other hand, a silent invitation, and Eleanor took it. Together, they moved closer to the hearth, warmth embracing them, the flicker of flames mirroring the quiet intensity of shared vulnerability. Words fell away, unnecessary in the presence of so much unspoken understanding. The space between them contracted, a tension delicate yet charged, until finally, the Duke leaned forward, his forehead resting gently against hers. Eleanor felt the pulse of life in his chest, a rhythm that resonated with her own, a tactile affirmation of devotion stronger than any ceremony, louder than any society's verdict. "I have chosen you," he whispered, voice barely audible above the crackle of the fire. "In spite of all, beyond all, and with every part of me that cannot lie." The intensity of his declaration struck Eleanor to the core, a force both terrifying and exhilarating. Her lips parted, a breathless acknowledgement, and she pressed her hands to his chest, feeling the steady beat of a heart wholly given, wholly fearless. In that moment, all the judgments, all the letters, all the whispered doubts of salons past dissolved into irrelevance. The storm of society raged outside, but within this chamber, their devotion was a fortress, unassailable, sacred, and infinite. The night deepened, and Eleanor allowed herself a rare abandon. Tears, not of shame, but of relief and joy. The Duke's thumb brushed against her knuckles, grounding her in a reality that was both tender and fierce. Words returned, soft, murmured, shared in the intimacy of confession. "I feared," she admitted, voice trembling, "that I would never be enough for them, for anyone." He shook his head, pressing his lips to her temple, a gesture that spoke volumes beyond any declaration of affection. "You are enough," he said, the simplicity of the truth resounding more powerfully than any grandiose promise. "For me, for us, for everything we dare to build together." Hours passed in quiet communion, measured not by candlelight but by shared breath, exchanged glances, and the comfort of presence. The world beyond the walls of Westcliff Manor continued its scrutiny, the voices of London's elite whispering through corridors of imagination. Yet within the chamber, Eleanor discovered an inviolable truth. Love, when grounded in courage and authenticity, could withstand scorn, rumor, and expectation. The fire had burned away the last vestiges of self-doubt, leaving a luminous certainty. They were partners, bound not by circumstance, but by deliberate choice, by shared endurance, by the unwavering acknowledgement of one another's soul. At dawn, the first light of morning filtered through tall windows, spilling across the room in shards of gold and rose. Eleanor and the Duke stood together at the balcony, hands entwined, gazing at the gardens glistening with dew. The city beyond remained awake, alive with judgment and anticipation, yet they did not flinch. The storm had not ended, but they had claimed their place within it, together, resolute and unbroken. The Duke's voice, soft and certain, broke the silence. "Let them speak, Eleanor. We have discovered the truth they cannot touch." Eleanor smiled, the journal tucked against her heart, a symbol of vulnerability met with courage, love forged through trial. And in that shared silence, the promise of tomorrow shimmered, brilliant and untamed, a testament that devotion, when chosen, defended, and cherished, could render even the harshest world powerless.